My parents always said I wasn't manly compared to my golden boy brother because I like art. Now, I've built a successful design company. They want me to pay for my brother's baby because family comes first. I guess I should start by saying I've always been different from the rest of my family. Growing up, I loved to draw and mess around with art, which didn't exactly fit the image my parents had for me. I'm 29 years old, and from as early as I can remember, my parents just couldn't understand why I wasn't into the boy stuff they thought I should be doing. My older brother, though, was perfect in their eyes. He played soccer, was athletic, and just fit their idea of what a man should be. Me? I liked drawing and spent most of my time sketching or playing around with design ideas, and they just didn't get it. It wasn't like I didn't try to make them happy. I did, but no matter how good my grades were or how much time I put into my art, it didn't matter because my parents always favored my brother. It was like they couldn't even see me unless it was to compare me to him. I remember one birthday, my brother had this huge soccer-themed party. They rented out the local field, and all his friends showed up. He got this giant cake shaped like a soccer ball. I got a card, signed from the family. I didn't even bother showing my parents the sketch I'd worked on for weeks. I knew they wouldn't care. The only one who ever really paid attention to me was my grandfather. He was into art too, and every time he visited, he'd bring me something. Sketchbooks, colored pencils, that kind of stuff. I remember being excited every time he'd come over because at least he got it. Those small gestures meant a lot, especially since my parents didn't see the point in supporting my art. He used to tell me about painters he liked, and even though no one else was paying attention, I didn't care because I knew he was. Anyway, by the time I hit high school, it was pretty clear I wasn't going to fit into my parents' idea of success. I was good at web design, though. I picked it up after messing around with WordPress and realized I could actually do something with it. My brother, of course, was still the golden child, winning soccer tournaments and planning for college with full family support. They pushed him to aim for big things, but when it came to me, they barely noticed my plans. In high school, I spent a lot of time building websites for small businesses around town. My friends and I even made fake companies just for fun, like my buddy Chris, who sold sneakers and had me build his website. I didn't charge him or anything. It was just cool to have someone appreciate my work. And the thing that really set the tone for everything was how they treated us when we started thinking about college. They made sure my brother had everything he needed, even helping him look at schools out of state. I remember them sitting around the dinner table with brochures from different universities, talking about scholarships and soccer programs like it was all so important. But for me, they wanted me to go to the cheapest community college. They didn't care that I'd been busting my butt building up a web design portfolio and getting good grades. It was like nothing I did mattered. So, fast forward a bit. By the time college rolled around, I was pretty much done trying to fit into my family's expectations. I ended up getting into a decent school for web design, but of course my parents barely acknowledged it. They were too busy making a big deal about my brother's soccer scholarship, talking about how proud they were and how he was going to make something of himself. Meanwhile, I quietly packed up my stuff and moved into a dorm, which honestly was the best thing that ever happened to me. I guess that was the first time I really felt free. No more comparisons. No more being made to feel like I wasn't good enough. I could just focus on what I enjoyed, and it wasn't long before I started making real money building websites. I reached out to a few local businesses near my college, offered to design their sites for cheap, and once they saw my work, the word spread. I didn't need to ask my parents for money. They didn't even know I was making my own income. It felt great, like I was finally proving I didn't need their approval. Meanwhile, my brother was still riding high on his soccer success. Every time I came home for holidays, it was the same story. He'd talk nonstop about his games, his teammates, how he was being scouted by this or that coach. My parents ate it up. I'd try to share what I was doing too, like how I had landed a couple of bigger clients, or how I was thinking about starting my own business after college. But it was like talking to a wall. They'd nod politely, maybe ask a couple of questions, but then immediately turn the conversation back to my brother. I started avoiding home as much as I could after that. What was the point? My brother had become their entire world. And I was just the one they didn't have to worry about anymore because I wasn't asking for anything. The only time I'd hear from them was when they needed help with something tech-related. Can you fix our Wi-Fi? Can you look at my computer? That's what I'd get. But when it came to what I was building for myself, nothing. The weird part is, I think my brother didn't even realize how much they favored him. He was always so caught up in his own life that he didn't notice how they treated me like an afterthought. It wasn't like he was mean about it, just clueless. One time, I remember him coming home with a new car my parents bought for him, and he didn't even think to ask if I'd ever gotten help with my tuition. He just assumed everything was fine for me because I wasn't complaining. The more I distanced myself from them, the more I realized I didn't need their validation. I had my own thing going, and my clients respected me more than my own family did. That was enough for me at the time. But of course, things took a turn when I found out my brother had gotten his girlfriend pregnant. That's when the calls started again. So, like I was saying, the calls started again out of nowhere. I hadn't heard much from my parents in months, maybe even close to a year. I was busy with my web design business, getting clients, building up a portfolio, and just enjoying life without the constant feeling that I had to prove myself to them. Then one day, I get this call from my mom. At first, I thought maybe they needed something tech-related fixed again. Wi-Fi, their printer, something like that. But no, this was different. She starts off with some small talk, which is already weird because she never calls unless she needs something. I could feel it coming, but I let her talk. Then she drops it. My brother's girlfriend is pregnant, and they need my help. Not my advice, not my emotional support. No, they need my money. I almost laughed, honestly. After all the years of them ignoring me, pushing me aside from my brother's soccer career, they suddenly remember I exist when there's a financial problem. My mom tried to make it sound like I should feel responsible, like because I'm doing well now, I should pitch in. She even threw in the guilt trip about how I'd be an uncle soon and how the baby would need me. That's when I started getting really angry. I didn't say much on the phone, just told her I'd think about it and hung up. But inside, I was fuming. How do you go from ignoring your own kid for years to suddenly asking him to help bail out your favorite child when he screws up? It wasn't even just the money. It was the principle of it. They'd always treated me like I didn't matter. And now, because I'd made something of myself, they wanted me to clean up my brother's mess? A couple of days later, my dad calls me too. Same story. He tries to spin it like family sticks together, that we help each other out in tough times. I couldn't believe the nerve. They'd never helped me, not once. And now they were trying to guilt me into supporting my brother just because he got someone pregnant and couldn't handle the responsibility. I knew if the situation were reversed, if I had been the one in trouble, they wouldn't have lifted a finger. But I guess the thing that really pissed me off was my brother himself. After all this, he still didn't bother reaching out. He just let our parents do the talking for him like it was no big deal. He probably assumed I'd cave because I was the nice one, the one who never made a fuss, but I wasn't going to let that slide. So I thought about it for a while, talked to a few friends, and eventually decided there was no way I was getting involved. So I called my mom back and told her no. No financial help, no handouts, nothing. She was quiet for a moment, and then she just hung up without saying much. I knew then that things were going to get ugly. Sure enough, a few days later, I start seeing passive-aggressive posts on Facebook from my brother, stuff about family loyalty and how some people think they're too good to help their own blood. It was obvious who he was talking about, but I didn't care. Let him throw a fit. I wasn't going to be manipulated into bailing him out just because he couldn't deal with the consequences of his own actions. But then it got worse. My parents started chiming in too. They tried to make it seem like I'd abandoned the family, like I was selfish for not wanting to support my brother. They even spread some lies about how they'd always supported me financially, which was a joke. I knew they were trying to smear me in front of the rest of the family, and at that point, I realized they didn't care about me. They just cared about their golden child. That's when I decided to set the record straight. If they wanted to play dirty, I wasn't going to stay quiet anymore. So after all that nonsense with my brother's posts and my parents' guilt trips, I hit my breaking point. I was done playing nice and letting them get away with making me the bad guy. I knew if I didn't say something, they'd keep spreading their lies and acting like I was the one who turned my back on the family. So I did something I didn't really plan on doing. I wrote a Facebook post of my own. At first, I wasn't even sure I wanted to go there, but after thinking about it for a couple of days, I realized I had nothing to lose. They had already decided I was the villain, so what was the point in staying quiet? I sat down at my laptop and wrote out everything. I mean everything. I talked about how my parents had always favored my brother, how they had never supported me, how they only reached out now because they needed money for my brother's baby. I didn't hold back. I made sure to include all the little details, like how I had put myself through school, built my web design business without their help, and how they had the nerve to act like they'd been there for me all along. I thought it was just going to be a vent, something to get it off my chest and maybe let a few close friends know what was going on. I didn't expect it to blow up like it did. Within hours, the post started getting shared. People from high school, old friends, even clients started commenting and sending me messages, telling me they had no idea what I'd been through and how proud they were of me for speaking up. It was wild. I didn't realize how many people related to the story. Some even started sharing their own stories about dealing with family favoritism and how they'd been in similar situations. The best part, though, was seeing how fast my family got wind of it. I guess one of our relatives must have seen it and called them because within a day, both my parents and my brother were losing their minds. My mom called me, furious. She said I was airing out dirty laundry and embarrassing the family. She kept saying it wasn't anyone else's business and I needed to take it down immediately. When I asked her if she even read the post, she went quiet for a second and then said she didn't need to. She knew I was exaggerating. That's how little she thought of what I had to say. To her, it was all about keeping up appearances. My dad texted me too, but his message was more of an apology wrapped in guilt. He said he was sorry if I felt like I was mistreated, but that I should delete the post so we could handle things privately, as a family. I wasn't buying it. They only cared because now everyone knew what was really going on. They didn't want to fix anything. They just wanted me to shut up. And then there was my brother. He didn't bother calling me. Instead, he posted another passive-aggressive status on Facebook about people who play the victim and family not being there when it counts. It was so typical. He couldn't even have a conversation with me like an adult. He just wanted to throw shade and make me look like the bad guy, but at that point, I didn't care anymore. I kept the post up. I wasn't going to let them bully me into silence. And I wasn't going to apologize for finally standing up for myself. The best part was, I had so many people backing me up, including a bunch of relatives who had never really known what was going on, but were now starting to see the truth. My parents tried to spin it like I was the one being unreasonable. But the more they tried to control the narrative, the more obvious it became that they just didn't want to take responsibility for anything. So yeah, the post stayed up. I wasn't going to back down. If they wanted to play family now just because they were embarrassed, it was too late. I had already moved on, and for the first time, it felt like I was finally in control of my own story. After that whole Facebook post blew up, things got pretty quiet for a while. I wasn't hearing much from my parents or my brother, which honestly was fine with me. They had made their stance clear, and I wasn't about to bend over backward to fix things for them. But then, out of nowhere, I get a text from my brother. It's been weeks since I last heard from him, and now he's acting like nothing happened. He doesn't mention the post, doesn't mention all the crap they were pulling. Instead, he just says we should meet up and talk. At first, I wasn't sure I even wanted to deal with him. I mean, after everything they tried to do, why bother? But part of me was curious. Maybe he was finally ready to own up to his mistakes, admit that the way our parents treated me wasn't right. So, I agreed to meet him. We met at some coffee shop downtown, and right off the bat, I could tell something was off. He didn't even seem sorry. It was like he was trying to act casual, like this was just another family chat and nothing serious had happened. We sat down, ordered some coffee, and he immediately starts talking about the baby and how stressful everything's been. I just listened for a while, waiting for him to get to the point, but after a few minutes, I realized he wasn't here to apologize or even talk about what happened. He was trying to butter me up. Sure enough, he finally gets around to asking me for help. Again. This time, though, it wasn't just money. He wanted me to help him build a website for some business idea he had. Something to help him make money since, apparently, being a soon-to-be dad wasn't leaving him with a lot of free time. He talked about how it would be great if I could just put something together for him for free, because we're family and all that. I couldn't believe it. After everything that went down, after all the garbage they tried to pull, he still had the nerve to sit there and ask me to do him a favor. It wasn't even about fixing things between us. He just wanted to use me. That's when I knew nothing had changed. All that talk about family loyalty, about how I should help because I was doing well, it was just manipulation. I let him finish his pitch. Then I told him flat out, no. I wasn't going to build him a website. I wasn't going to give him any money, and I wasn't going to clean up his mess. If he wanted to make something of himself, he could figure it out on his own, just like I had to. He didn't take it well, of course. He tried to guilt-trip me, talking about how I was abandoning him and the family, how I was being selfish. I just sat there, letting him rant, knowing full well this was the same old song and dance. When he realized I wasn't budging, he finally gave up and stormed out of the coffee shop without even finishing his drink. I watched him leave, half expecting some dramatic text message to pop up on my phone, but nothing came. That was it. That was when I knew there was no point in trying to fix things with him or my parents. They didn't care about me unless I could do something for them. My brother didn't want to mend fences. He just wanted to take advantage of me, like always. And honestly, I was fine with cutting them off for good at that point. If they weren't willing to acknowledge how they treated me over the years, I didn't need them in my life. I left the coffee shop feeling strangely calm. It was like a weight had been lifted. For so long, I'd felt like I had to prove myself to them, or at least get them to understand what they'd done wrong, but now I realized I didn't need their validation. I had built something on my own, without their help, and I wasn't about to let them drag me back down. When I got home, I sent a group text to my parents and brother laying it all out. I told them I was done with the games and the manipulation. If they couldn't admit how they treated me, if they couldn't apologize for the years of favoritism and neglect, then I didn't see the point in staying in touch. I wasn't going to be part of their lives if they only saw me as a backup plan. And that was that. I never heard back from them after that text. No apologies, no calls, nothing. And honestly, I'm okay with that. After that, things went quiet for a while, and I mean really quiet. It was like once I sent that text, my family just decided I didn't exist anymore. No follow-up, no attempts to reach out, not even from my brother. Part of me expected my parents to at least try something, even if it was just to save face, but there was nothing. And honestly, I felt a weird mix of relief and sadness. I wasn't heartbroken, but it did hit me how easy it was for them to just cut me off like that. I'd already made peace with it, though. I wasn't waiting for their apology anymore because I knew it wasn't coming. After that coffee shop meeting, it was clear that nothing had changed. If they weren't going to own up to their behavior, there was no point in dragging it out any longer. They didn't want to mend the relationship. They wanted to keep me around as a safety net, and I wasn't going to be that anymore. A couple of weeks after I sent that text, my grandfather called. He'd heard bits and pieces of what had gone down, but he didn't have all the details. I filled him in, told him about the Facebook post, the phone calls, the coffee shop blow-up. He was quiet for a long time, just listening to everything I had to say. And at the end of it all, he said something I didn't expect. "I'm proud of you." I almost laughed because, in a way, I'd been waiting my whole life to hear that from someone in my family. My parents never said it, and I knew my brother didn't care, but hearing it from my grandfather, it meant more than I realized. He told me he'd always known how my parents treated me was wrong, but he didn't want to overstep or make things worse when I was growing up. That hurt to hear, but I got it. He did what he could, and honestly, he was the only one who had ever made me feel like I wasn't a failure. We talked for a while after that. He didn't push me to reconnect with my family, didn't tell me I should forgive them, none of that. He just said he understood why I did what I did and that he was there for me. It was the first real, genuine conversation I'd had with a family member in a long time. After we hung up, I felt lighter. It's weird how much one conversation can change how you feel about everything. My grandfather didn't have to call me, and he definitely didn't have to take my side. But he did, and that was enough for me. It was like, for the first time, I felt like I had someone in my family who saw me for who I was, not who they wanted me to be. After that, I really started focusing on my work. The business was doing better than ever, and I was landing some bigger clients. I finally had the time and energy to put everything I had into my website design work, without the baggage of my family hanging over me. It felt good, like I could just be me, without worrying about whether I was living up to anyone else's expectations. Sure, sometimes I thought about my parents and my brother. It wasn't like I didn't care at all. I'd wonder if they were sitting around the dinner table, talking about me, wondering why I'd cut them off. But then I'd remind myself they probably weren't. They'd moved on, and so had I. The thing is, it wasn't about winning some argument or getting the last word. It was about finally letting go of the idea that I needed their approval. I didn't. I had built something for myself, something they had no part in, and for the first time, that was enough for me. And maybe that's all I really needed in the end, to prove to myself that I didn't need them to be happy. Life got a lot quieter after that call with my grandfather. I threw myself into my work and just kept moving forward. The weird thing about cutting off family is that it feels final at first, but then you realize it's not so much about them. It's about you. It's about what you do with the space that opens up after they're gone. I found myself with more time, more focus, and honestly, more peace than I'd felt in years. My business was growing steadily. I landed a few bigger clients, some e-commerce shops that wanted full website redesigns, and those projects kept me busy. It felt good knowing that all of this came from my own effort, without anyone's help or approval. But of course, life has a funny way of throwing curveballs just when you think you've got everything figured out. One day, I was working on a project when I got a message from one of my cousins. We hadn't spoken in years, and I wasn't even sure how she got my number, but she wanted to talk. Apparently, word had gotten around the family that I'd cut off my parents and my brother, and people were starting to take sides. At first, I didn't really care. I figured most of my extended family didn't even know half the story, and honestly, it wasn't their business anyway. But my cousin kept texting me, saying she understood why I did what I did, and she wanted to hear my side. She told me she'd been through something similar with her own parents, and that a lot of people in the family were actually on my side, even if they weren't saying it out loud. I didn't know how to feel about that. On one hand, it was nice to know that I wasn't completely alone in this, but on the other hand, I wasn't really interested in starting a whole family drama where people had to pick sides. It was exhausting just thinking about it. Eventually, I agreed to meet her for coffee. I wasn't expecting much, but I figured it couldn't hurt to talk. When we met up, she told me that a lot of our relatives were actually really shocked when they found out what had been going on between me and my parents. She said that most of them had always assumed I was doing fine, that everything was normal. My parents never mentioned anything about our issues, and my brother certainly wasn't telling anyone the truth. They all thought I had just drifted away on my own, not that I'd been pushed aside for years. That hit me harder than I expected. I knew my parents were good at putting up appearances, but I didn't realize just how deep that went. It made sense, though. They were always more concerned with how things looked than how they actually were. I guess it shouldn't have surprised me that they'd been downplaying everything, making it seem like I was just being distant for no reason. My cousin told me that after my Facebook post, a lot of people started seeing things differently. She said people were talking about how my parents had always favored my brother, and for the first time, it felt like people were actually starting to understand what I had gone through. I didn't know what to do with that information. I didn't want to be the center of a family scandal, but at the same time, I felt a weird sense of validation. Like, maybe I wasn't crazy after all. Maybe people really were starting to see things for what they were. But I told my cousin that I wasn't looking for sympathy. I wasn't interested in dragging the whole family into this. I had said my piece, and I was ready to move on. She understood, but she also told me that if I ever needed someone in the family to talk to, she was there. That was something I didn't expect, and I appreciated it more than I let on. After we parted ways, I thought about what she'd said. For the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought. But at the same time, I knew I didn't need the family's approval anymore. It wasn't about getting them to take my side. It was about standing on my own 2 feet and moving forward, no matter what they thought. Then things settled down again after that conversation with my cousin. It was nice knowing someone in the family got it, but I didn't reach out much after that. I was still focused on keeping my distance and just doing my own thing. I thought that was it, that the whole family drama was finally behind me. Then, out of the blue, I get a call from my dad. This time, it wasn't some passive-aggressive attempt to guilt me into helping out my brother. It was different. He sounded tired. He told me that my grandfather had passed away. I sat there for a minute, not really processing it. I hadn't seen my grandfather in a while, but we'd talked a few times since everything went down. He was the only one I still had some connection to, the only one in the family who had my back, who saw me for who I was and didn't try to change me. Now he was gone. My dad asked if I was coming to the funeral. That was it, just a simple question. No small talk, no catch. I told him I'd think about it and hung up, but I already knew I was going. I wasn't going for them. I was going for my grandfather. The day of the funeral came, and I kept to myself. I wasn't interested in rekindling things with my parents or my brother. When I walked into the service, it was like stepping into a different world, a world I'd left behind but still somehow knew all too well. I saw my parents, but I didn't approach them. I didn't need to. This wasn't about them. I found a quiet spot near the back and sat through the service, mostly zoning out. My mind kept going back to all the times my grandfather had been there for me when no one else was. He didn't say much, but when he did, it mattered. He believed in me when my own parents didn't. He was the only family member who ever said he was proud of me. That's what stuck with me the most. After the service, people started mingling, offering condolences, talking about memories. I wasn't really in the mood for it, so I hung back. Then, out of nowhere, my mom walked over to me. I braced myself, thinking this was going to be some attempt at a forced reconciliation or worse, another guilt trip. But she just stood there for a second, then said, "Your grandfather really cared about you." It caught me off guard because it wasn't what I expected. There was no lecture, no passive-aggressive tone, just that. Then she asked if I was doing okay, but it wasn't in the usual dismissive way. She actually seemed to mean it. I told her I was fine. We stood there in awkward silence for a few moments, and then she said, "He was proud of you, you know? He told me that once." That hit me harder than I wanted to admit. I nodded and said, "I know." And then she just walked away. That was it. No big moment, no deep conversation. Just a small acknowledgement. It wasn't the apology I knew I'd never get, but it was something. It didn't fix things. But in that moment, it didn't need to. I realized then that I didn't need them to validate me anymore. Not my parents, not my brother, none of them. My grandfather had been the only one who ever saw me, and I had to hold on to that. I left the funeral without talking to anyone else. I didn't need closure from them because I'd already found it for myself. After that, I went home, poured myself a drink, and sat on my balcony, just thinking. Life has a way of circling back on you, doesn't it? You try to move forward, but sometimes the past sneaks up on you when you least expect it. But sitting there, I knew that no matter what, I was done chasing their approval. My grandfather's belief in me was enough, and I had built something for myself, something they couldn't touch. After the funeral, things went back to normal, or at least my version of normal. I threw myself back into work, pushing forward with a few big projects I had lined up. The silence from my family was almost comforting by then. I wasn't waiting for calls, wasn't checking messages, just living my life. But of course, just when I thought I was done with all of it, my brother shows up. Literally. No warning, no call, just knocks on my door like we're best friends who talk all the time. I hadn't seen him since that coffee shop conversation, and trust me, I wasn't exactly excited to catch up. When I opened the door, he just stood there for a second, looking a bit lost. He had this sheepish look on his face, which was weird because my brother was never the apologetic type. I almost didn't let him in, but something about the way he just stood there made me curious enough to hear him out. He walked in and sat down on my couch, looking around my place like he'd never seen it before. I could tell he was uncomfortable, and honestly, I was too. He didn't start talking right away, just kind of sat there in silence. I didn't rush him. I wasn't about to make this easy for him. Finally, he starts. He says he's sorry. Not in the usual, half-hearted way he used to say it when we were kids just to get out of trouble. This time it felt different. He said he was sorry for how he treated me, for how he'd let our parents always pit us against each other. He admitted that he'd been selfish and blind to what was really going on between me and the family. I just sat there, letting him get it all out. Part of me wanted to tell him to shove it, but another part of me was listening. Really listening. He kept talking about how he didn't realize how messed up it was, how he'd been so wrapped up in his own world that he never bothered to see mine. He admitted that he'd coasted through life on the approval of our parents and never stopped to think about how that might have felt for me. That part hit me harder than I expected. He didn't ask for anything, which was probably the most surprising part of the whole thing. I kept waiting for the catch, but it never came. He didn't ask for money or a website or any help with the baby. He just sat there, apologizing and owning up to what he'd done. I won't lie, it was hard to take it all in. After years of being treated like the outsider, I didn't know how to respond. Part of me was still angry, still hurt, and I wasn't sure if an apology, even an honest one, was enough to fix everything. So I told him the truth. I told him that while I appreciated the apology, it didn't erase all the years of being sidelined, of feeling like I didn't matter. I told him how hard it was for me to even be in the same room as him sometimes because of how our parents had set us up to compete for their attention. He listened, really listened, in a way he never had before. When I was done, he nodded and said he understood. He didn't push, didn't try to defend himself or make excuses. He just accepted it. Then he got up to leave. And as he walked to the door, he turned and said something I wasn't expecting. He said he wanted to rebuild our relationship, but only if I was open to it. He told me that whether or not I was ready to forgive him, he was going to try to be a better brother. I didn't say anything. I didn't know what to say. I just stood there, watching him walk out the door, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel angry. I wasn't sure what to make of it all, but I knew that something had shifted. Maybe it wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was a start. I didn't reach out after that, and he didn't push. But a part of me was curious about what would happen next. Could we really rebuild after everything that had happened? I didn't know the answer, but I was willing to take it one step at a time.